Transylvania. What comes to mind? Yeah, some of you may be thinking about Dracula and vampires and the blood-sucking mythology that this land is famous for, right? But all myth aside, Transylvania actually has a very special place in Unitarian as well as world religious history. What was once known as the Kingdom of Transylvania was at times under Turkish Ottoman rule, later it was under Austro-Hungarian rule, and then Russian governance. And today the area is a part of both Hungary and Romania. But more importantly, it was the place where Unitarianism first became an official religion. In 1568, on January 13th to be exact, the Edict of Religious Toleration was signed into law in a town called Torda in the Kingdom of Transylvania. So why is this important to us now? It's 450 years later on a different continent and in a different time. Why is it still significant? Well, for starters, it marked the beginning of Unitarianism as an official religion, and that's pretty important for us gathered here, or we wouldn't be here. It was also the first time that the freedom of conscience and religion were officially enacted. It was a radical vision for the time. All would be respected for their beliefs rather than persecuted for their differences. It laid the foundation for our free-thinking faith that even now is sometimes too radical for people to grasp. It was the origin of the idea, deeds, not creeds. Actions speaking louder than words. And it began the concept in our Unitarian Universalist faith that what you believe is less important than how you live. This Edict of Torda, allowing people to practice their religion freely, also later became the inspiration for the religious portion of our American Declaration of Independence. So it's had a major impact on our society and faith throughout time. Now, prior to the edict, Unitarianism had been a set of ideas espoused by a few at great personal risk. Those brave anti-Trinitarians argued that they could find no biblical basis that God was divided into the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Instead, they believed that God was one and indivisible. They didn't think of Jesus as the Son of God, but rather as a great humanitarian and an inspiration to live a life of love. They wanted to follow Jesus, not worship him. Now, this, of course, was considered great heresy at that time because it contravened the Trinity and the divinity of Christ, which the Catholic Church had established in the Nicene Creed 1,200 years earlier. Since both the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Inquisition were in full stride at that time, any dissenting blood was freely being shed. Far too many were being executed or burned at the stake for their heretical beliefs. The price for questioning was the loss of everything. So how did the small kingdom of Transylvania become the first and only state to officially sanction Unitarianism as the state religion? Well, I'm glad you asked. We have immigrants to thank for that. A small group of Italian humanists who held these beliefs fled persecution throughout Europe to find safe haven. One such man was a particularly enlightened philosopher, theologian, and physician, George Biandrata. He escaped to Transylvania and became the court physician and trusted advisor to Queen Isabella of Hungary, and she's not to be confused with Queen Isabella of Spain. Her husband, the King of Transylvania, had died only 2 weeks after she gave birth to their only son. So Queen Isabella, educated in the classical Italian Renaissance humanist tradition and influenced by her alliances with the Muslim Ottoman Empire, became regent of her son, the young King John Sigismund. She ruled in his stead in Transylvania for 20 years. But what I was surprised to discover was that the 1568 Edict of Torda was actually not the first edict of religious toleration in Europe or even in Transylvania. In fact, it was a woman who persisted in establishing religious freedom. It was Queen Isabella herself who began the process of religious freedom in that country with an initial edict of religious toleration 11 years earlier. And equally important, she raised her son John with those views, and that is what laid the groundwork for the later Edict of Torda. Earlier, you heard Robin read the official 1568 edict. But let me read you the edict from Isabella 11 years earlier in 1557. Inasmuch as we and our most serene Son have assented that each person maintain whatever religious faith he wishes, with old or new rituals, while we at the same time leave it to their judgment to do as they please in the matters of faith, just so long, however, that they bring no harm to bear on anyone at all, lest the followers of a new religion be a source of irritation to the old profession of faith, or become some way injurious to its followers. Wow. Right? What a visionary, humanitarian, inclusive statement from a woman, largely ignored by history, yet she persisted. Thank you, Isabella. Can you imagine our government today even affirming such freedoms? Strangely, but perhaps not surprisingly, the history books and the stories that we were taught in seminary gloss over Queen Isabella's notable influence in establishing Transylvania as the first place where religious freedom existed. Nevertheless, she clearly had a significant effect on her son. After her death in 1559, and inspired by his mother's humanism, as well as his court preacher, Francis David, the young King John Sigismund made Unitarianism the religion of the land and insisted on religious freedom for all. Soon, there were 425 Unitarian parishes in Transylvania. Now, Francis David, his court minister, whom we saw in the painting earlier and who's on the front of your order of service with his arm raised up as the light of the divine shines upon him with inspiration, he had studied in Wittenberg, where Luther's Reformation began. David is often spoken about as one of the greatest theologians of all time. He never ceased in his theological exploration and growth, much like many of us Unitarian Universalists today. David had first been a Catholic priest. Later, he became a Lutheran, and then a Calvinist bishop. So he understood pluralism firsthand. By 1566, he'd begun preaching the new doctrine of Unitarianism and settled on this inclusive faith. He was purported to have said, "You need not think alike to love alike," which really sums up our Unitarian Universalist faith very neatly. You need not think alike to love alike. And those words have aged exceedingly well. Following the Edict of Torda, many converted to Unitarianism. They were inspired by its emphasis on the rational interpretation of the Bible. They liked its stress on freedom of thought and on tolerance. In fact, Transylvania became the first and only place in Europe where so many religions could coexist together in harmony and without persecution. And King John Sigismund had the honor of being the only ever Unitarian king. Tragically, King Sigismund died only 3 years later. And with him went religious innovation, though tolerance continued a little while longer. When Sigismund's Catholic nephew took the throne, Francis David was imprisoned and further theological innovation was forbidden. David died soon after due to the barbaric conditions of the prison he was in. Francis David's prayers in his mountaintop cell were legendary. He prayed that the human spirit should be as free to explore as the birds riding the wind, exploring without limitation. Francis David's vision from the mountaintop about religious freedom has at times been compared to Martin Luther King Jr.'s mountaintop vision of racial freedom and equality. Both were envisioning a future that would take generations to behold. Both were envisioning what for us as Unitarian Universalists are key principles: the inherent worth and dignity of all, the freedom to be respected for who you are, the awareness that we are all interconnected. Unitarianism struggled to exist after David's death. It eventually went underground for 400 years in Hungary and Romania. Talk about perseverance. The Transylvanian Unitarians were so committed to the idea of religious toleration and the oneness of God that this faith survived in spite of centuries of persecution. They persevered. And it survives today in a similar way that it was practiced at that time. There was a brief resurgence of Unitarianism when Polish exiles came to Transylvania in the 1730s, but mostly Unitarianism declined in that part of the world. Only a few churches survived centuries of Catholic and then communist oppression. But today, there are still about 90,000 people practicing Unitarianism in the region, with about 140 Unitarian churches remaining. Now, as many of you know, American Unitarianism became a recognized faith in 1819 with William Ellery Channing's seminal sermon, Unitarian Christianity. By 1832, American Unitarians became aware of the existence of the Transylvanian Unitarians. And in 1900, the American Unitarian Association invited leaders of the Transylvanian Unitarian Church to the first International Association for Religious Freedom Conference. Since then, there have been strong and ongoing partnerships between Unitarians in Transylvania and American Unitarian Universalist congregations. In fact, many U.S. congregations have Transylvanian partner churches, exchanging ideas and support and visits. And this might be something for us to consider at some point in our future. Last year, as part of my continuing education and representation of CVUUF outside of these walls, I attended the International Unitarian Universalist Women's Conference with some of you here. It was really moving to experience a worship service led by female Unitarian ministers from Transylvania. Their version of Unitarianism is still distinctly Christian. They are theists, and they celebrate communion. We share certain hymns like Spirit of Life, which we just sung, as well as the chalice symbol. But other than that, our liturgy is quite different. In a way, Transylvanian Unitarianism still reflects its 16th century form. Reverend James Ishmael Ford tells a wonderful story of a colleague, Reverend John Gibbons, who visited one of the partner churches in Transylvania. It was 1994, and intrigued by stories they'd heard, and even though few could even find Transylvania on a map, the Bedford, Massachusetts congregation decided to sign up for our denomination's new partner church project. They promptly found themselves teamed up with a congregation in a tiny village somewhere on the outskirts of nowhere on the edge of Transylvania. They decided to send a delegation to see what they'd gotten themselves into. Arrangements were made, transportation was put together, and they took off. Days later, as the two Volkswagen buses carrying them made their way out to the edge of nowhere, perhaps a mile or so from the village, they were stopped by a band of young men on horseback and young women in horse-drawn carts. They were all dressed in traditional garb for the occasion. And one of the young people then read from a proclamation in which the villagers declared this visit was as important to them as the Magi who made their way to Bethlehem. All of a sudden, Reverend John felt woefully underdressed. In his tellings of this adventure and all that followed, John describes that it was life-transforming for him. It offered both a picture of a different kind of Unitarianism than we know, and an invitation to take our own liberal faith more seriously, and possibly even in new and deeper directions. So, in 2018, as we celebrate the 450th anniversary of that momentous movement towards religious freedom, I invite us to reflect deeply and seriously on our liberal faith. Though we have religious freedom in this country and in our Constitution, I am struck that Unitarian Universalism is still a rather progressive faith. Particularly these days. There's still a tremendous amount of judgment and condemnation between one religion and another. There's this sense that each religion has the one and only answer and that everyone else is wrong. Even these days, when I attend our Conejo Valley interfaith meetings, we're still considered somewhat of an enigma because we don't prescribe what our people are supposed to believe, and we're not exactly traditionally Christian. For myself, I'm proud to be a Unitarian Universalist. I'm proud to be part of this lineage of religious and civic freedom. I'm proud that my faith was one of the first in the world to allow people to find their own path to truth and meaning, to choose their beliefs based on their conscience, their experience, and their knowledge. I'm proud that over the centuries, we have persevered to fight for the freedom of all. In the mid-1800s, Unitarian minister and abolitionist Theodore Parker had a gun at his pulpit to protect fugitive, enslaved people in his congregation. I'm proud of other reformers, such as Charles Spear and Dorothea Dix, who worked for prison reform and to break the chains of people incarcerated in mental hospital. I'm proud of the UU women who fought for equal rights and respect for women like Susan B. Anthony and Margaret Fuller and Olympia Brown. And I'm proud of those UUs who showed up for the civil rights movement and put their lives on the line to fight for freedom and respect for all. James Reeb, a Unitarian Universalist minister, and Viola Luzzo, a UU congregant, were murdered in Selma after answering Martin Luther King Jr.'s call to march for justice and freedom. I am proud that we can all be here worshiping in this room together. Some of us with Christian theology, others with Jewish customs, some of us Buddhist, some of us Hindu or Muslim, and yet others humanists or atheists. It moves me profoundly when we all join hands together in the greater service of unity and love. Our true triumph lies not, I think, in persuading one another that our individual path is the correct path, but rather that collectively we accept and respect one another, no matter what our belief system. We do our best to listen and understand one another, and we value deeds over creeds. We try to walk our talk. Freedom can be a challenging concept for institutions. It challenges governments, and it challenges religions. It challenges any institution that believes control is necessary to create order. So I'm extremely grateful to the Unitarians who persevered and sacrificed, both in Europe and the US, to fight for this idea of religious freedom. It is precious. It has been hard fought and hard won. So as we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, I invite us, no matter how much it stretches us, to live fully into this freedom and tolerance. As we sit next to each other in this fellowship every week, I invite us to remember the ultimate sacrifices that our forebears made to ensure our gift of freedom. To honor their incredible courage for the idea, the radical, heretical idea that we should be able to choose our own beliefs. Because of them, we are free today to believe what feels right for each of us, to choose our theology without persecution. And I invite us always to remember that gift and respect that diversity in one another. My friends, may we remember to be curious about each other's paths to truth and meaning. May we strive to be open and welcoming of our divergent views. And may we never forget to honor this precious freedom our ancestors fought for centuries to attain. Our ancestors fought for hundreds of years for the freedoms we enjoy today. So I ask you, what legacy will we leave for generations to come? May you be inspired. Blessed be.